Women are entitled to half of the US men's national team's earnings from this year's FIFA World Cup. And unsurprisingly, there are a lot of people upset about this and very disingenuous headlines that are made to make you upset about this without understanding what's going on. So today we are going to talk about the US women's national team fight for equal pay, how outrageous and nasty it got, and how the 4-year lawsuit ultimately resulted in, yes, women not only being paid equally, but receiving half of the US men's national team prize. Welcome to a special episode of Marissa Explains It All. If you're new here on this channel, I break down sports and culture and where the two of them intersect. And of course, women's sports always end up in these conversations where people want to be upset about things without really understanding what's going on. So this year, the US men's national team went further than they have gone in the FIFA World Cup since 2002. And objectively, our men's national team is not the best we have to offer when it comes to soccer. This year, the US men's national team was eliminated in the round of 16. Again, this is the best they've done since 2002, and in that tournament, they made it to the quarterfinals before being eliminated. If you look at the entirety of the history of the Men's World Cup, the US men's national team has only ever finished as high as 3rd, and they did that back in 1930. Since then, they've made the quarterfinal in 2002, and most of the time are eliminated before that. In 2018, they failed to even qualify for the World Cup, and this year they received an automatic slot due to the fact that the US was one of the host nations. With the FIFA World Cup, if your country is hosting, you do receive an automatic bid the same way that you do when you are hosting the Olympics. So understanding the performance of the US men's national team is pretty important when we talk about this fight for equal pay. The US women's national team, by comparison, has been an incredibly dominant force when it comes to the world of soccer. When we look at the US women's national team performance at the FIFA World Cup, they have won 4 titles. The first one was in 1991, followed by a very famous run in 1999 where they won, and you probably recognize some pretty famous pictures from that World Cup. And they're actually making a movie about this World Cup run called The 99ers, which I personally am really excited about. That movie actually is set to include a lot of real gameplay from the actors and involved a lot of the actual players from that 99 squad. The US women's national team won another World Cup in 2015 and went back-to-back in 2019. If you're new to the world of soccer, the FIFA World Cup happens every 4 years. So 2015 and 2019 are back-to-back titles, despite the fact that there is 4 years in between them. And it's on a separate cycle than the Men's World Cup, which also happens every 4 years. So this year, 2026, we had the Men's World Cup, which is 4 years after the last one they had in 2022. And next year, we will have the Women's World Cup, which is in 2027, followed by 2 years off before we have the Men's World Cup in 2030. Part of this cycle also gives space for the Olympics. So when you look at the massive kind of world level soccer tournaments that we're going to have, we have the FIFA Men's World Cup in 2026, the FIFA Women's World Cup in 2027, and the Summer Olympics, which will also take place in the US in 2028. Then we pick up with the Men's World Cup again in 2030. The other thing that is really important to understand when we're talking about this fight for equal pay is that the FIFA World Cup is not the only time the US national teams play soccer. The rosters named to both the men's and the women's teams are playing every year. They play a certain number of exhibition games a year, and they also play in other tournaments. For example, the women play in a She Believes tournament. Now, all of these national team obligations are separate from the obligations these players have when they're playing for their own clubs. Men on the US national team may play in Major League Soccer, or they may play overseas, and the same is the case for the women's players. A lot of them play in the National Women's Soccer League here in the US, and they could play overseas if they wanted to. When it comes to Team USA soccer, it's being controlled by the US Soccer Federation. It's important to understand that that is different from something like the National Women's Soccer League or MLS. What we're talking about in this video, in this lawsuit, and in this equal pay situation is how the US Soccer Federation, a single employer, paid and treated both the athletes on the men's team and on the women's team. The US Soccer Federation employed both of these teams and was treating them unequally when it came to both pay and facilities. To understand what the situation was like, I want to walk you through how the payment structure works for an athlete on one of these teams. Whether you're on the men's team or the women's team, you are required to play in a certain number of matches, and the way that you're paid for being on this team, the way that you would kind of consider a salary in a different type of job, is based on the games that you play in. Each player receives a certain amount of money just for showing up to the game, putting their uniform on, getting on the field, and being on the active roster. In addition to that base pay rate, there are also incentives in terms of performance. These include bonuses for winning a game, bonuses for qualifying for the World Cup or for other tournaments, and of course bonuses for winning the World Cup, winning games at the World Cup, qualifying to a certain level, and other international competitions such as other tournaments. When we look at numbers that were made public in 2016, these figures are from a New York Times report. We can see that there was an immediate discrepancy not only in base pay, but also in what the max earnings were for these players, despite the fact that they were playing the same number of games games on a field that was the same size for the same amount of gameplay minutes. When it comes to women's soccer and men's soccer, it is the same field and it is the same amount of time. So we're talking about the exact same number of days that you show up for work, the exact same amount of work that you have to put in, and the same expectations, but for a different amount of money. If you look at these numbers from 2016, the base pay for showing up to a game for the women's team was $3,600. Meanwhile, the base pay for the men's team showing up to a game was $5,000. These are per player numbers, so this is what every person on the squad was paid for showing up. If these players won their game, there was an additional bonus, a win bonus. That performance bonus for the women was $1,350 per win. Meanwhile, for the men, it was $8,166 per win. So when we look at the base pay for showing up and also the performance bonuses that were available to these players, the absolute minimum that a player on the US women's national team would make was $72,000. This is for participating in the 20 required games and if they lost every single one of them. Meanwhile, the minimum for the men's team for the same amount of gameplay, the same number of games, and losing all of those games would have been a base pay of $100,000. If the women won every single one of the matches they played, they would actually earn $1,000 less than the men would earn for losing every single one of their games. If the men won every single one of their matches, they would make over $263,000, which, as you can tell, is almost triple the amount of money that the women were possibly able to make. It's important to note in these facts and figures that are provided by the New York Times that they do state that these bonuses for the men are averaged out over the different types of bonuses that they could receive for winning. The minimum win bonus that they had was $6,250, and the maximum was actually over $17,000. Again, for the women, that number was always $1,350 per win. Another aspect of compensation when it comes to this type of work is what we call a per diem. There's a travel allowance for things like flights and hotels, and there's also frequently an amount of money that's given to players for them to be able to pay for food. The men were given a higher allowance when it came to per diem, despite the fact that they are made up of the same number of players on the team, and this was the case for both domestic and international travel. In addition to this, we also saw that the women's team was paid $750 less for their appearance fee when it came to sponsorship requirements. And then, of course, we have the World Cup bonuses. Now, the maximum bonus that the US women's national team players could earn when it came to winning the World Cup was $75,000. Comparatively, if the men had ever managed to actually win a World Cup, they would have earned over $390,000 each. When we look at the way that the prize funds are spread, the women actually earn significantly less for winning the entire World Cup than the men do for getting eliminated early. Now, a lot of the argument you're going to see about this, of people saying that women didn't deserve to be paid equally when it came to the World Cup, is that FIFA themselves actually give a smaller prize fund for the Women's World Cup than they do for the Men's World Cup, and it is a pretty staggering difference. For example, when the US women's national team won the 2019 World Cup, their portion of the prize fund was $4 million. By comparison, the US men's national team earned $16 million this year, even though they were eliminated so early. The argument that you'll see a lot of people make is that the men earned that prize fund and that they should be entitled to all of it, and it's not their fault that the women's prize fund is smaller. However, here's the very big difference that was also very important in this lawsuit. FIFA does not pay the US soccer player individual directly. Regardless for any team, whether it's the US teams or we're talking about another country, FIFA pays the soccer federation of that country whatever they have earned from this World Cup. So the way that the prize fund works is there's a certain amount of money that is for the entirety of the prize fund, and based on where your team finishes, you get a percentage of that prize fund. So again, for 2019, the Women's World Cup was worth $30 million total, and the winner's prize fund was $4 million. That money is then paid to the US Soccer Federation, and that federation, which employs all of these players, has the ability to decide how that money is distributed and how they utilize it for their operating costs. So it's not a prize fund that FIFA is giving directly to the players. It's a sum that's paid to the US Soccer Federation that then gets to decide how they want to utilize it to build their program and to pay their players and their employees. And it's really important to understand that this is not the only way that these players are earning money for the US Soccer Federation. They compete in other tournaments, and if this was the only way that these players were able to make money, in 2018, every man on the US men's national team roster would have earned a total of $0. And that's because they didn't even qualify for the World Cup that year. So that's a pretty basic breakdown of how these players are actually paid. And it's pretty obvious that the women's team was being paid less upfront for a higher level of performance. Same game, same amount of work, same amount of time on the field, and same number of required games to play, but less money paid and a significantly smaller ability to earn based off of their performance. Now, the other portion of this lawsuit was not just about unequal pay based off of gender. It was also about unequal treatment and resources. The US women's national team was not only being given less money when it came to travel, they were also being given subpar facilities, less resources when it came to training, and overall less access to recovery dietary and training facilities. So when you look at everything, they were not only being paid less, they were being given less support to actually succeed. And with all of that in mind, they were still overly outplaying the men. So with all of that in mind, we come to 2019, where the US women's national team decided to do something that had never been done before. They decided to sue the US Soccer Federation for unequal treatment based on gender. They filed this lawsuit 3 months before the 2019 World Cup was set to start. And at this point, the US women's national team was filling stadiums. People were really excited about this. And to be honest, I don't know how many of you were soccer fans growing up, but the US women's national team were icons, especially at this period. Not only was the US women's national team full of icons that started in the 90s, legends that you still hear about even if you weren't alive at the time, like Mia Hamm, Abby Wambach. There were so many incredible players that were already on the team and had already built this kind of legacy. But in 2015 and 2019, those rosters were full of people that you're still hearing about today, and they were huge, huge legends. Very importantly, we're talking about players like Megan Rapinoe, who was one of the captains of the team at the time and spearheaded this lawsuit. However, there were players at this time on this roster that actually had other full-time jobs to be able to support themselves and their families in addition to playing professional soccer for their country. In the documentary LFG, which follows this lawsuit, one of the players talked about the fact that she had friends who were waitressing making 3 times what she was making a year. And she had a secondary job packing boxes for $12 an hour for Amazon. At this point, you're not only talking about resources in terms of whether you're being paid a fair wage or not, but you're talking about the ability to really focus on your sport and be the best that you possibly can be at this job. If you have to leave a full day of training to then go to a full night of working at Amazon in a warehouse packing boxes, and then at some point you're going to go home and attempt to kind of see your family, see your children, live your life, maybe take a nap or sleep after an extremely intense amount of physical labor and work, how exactly are you supposed to get up the next morning and show up for practice in a way that is World Cup worthy, Olympic worthy, US national team worthy? When we talk about pay discrepancies and equal pay for women and the amount of money that we need to be invested in women's sports, it's not just about the idea of equality. It's also about the idea of accessibility. What type of person and what type of background of that person has the ability to actually show up to work where they're losing money doing it? For some of these women who were mothers, the cost of childcare was more than they were making from the entirety of their appearance on the US women's national team. So how exactly can we expect women that are supposed to be professional athletes to play at a professional level while they also have to maintain a secondary career, but a career that can deal with the fact that they have to leave to go play soccer internationally for months at a time? This is not something that is a reasonable ask. It's a system that we see not only in US women's soccer, but across a lot of women's sports in general. We see this argument that women's sports are not playing at the same ability as men, or that they don't have the same amount of audience, or that they're not kind of giving their all and their dedication to it. But a lot of the people who say that are not talking about the actual system that is in place that keeps it from becoming something like that. When we're talking about professional women's sporting leagues, if you're not able to pay your bills with that money, you have to find a way to pay your bills another way. And that means you are not putting 100% of your effort and your ability into your career as a professional athlete, which means that you physically cannot perform in the best possible way that you could. So when you put all of that into perspective, you have to realize that the US women's national team was not only showing up and getting paid less, they were also working harder, winning more games, and working additional jobs to be able to do any of that. They were taking favors from family, from strangers, from friends, finding ways to make ends meet, and on top of that, outperforming the men who were able to do this full time. And that's not even to think about the cost of actual training, the diet that you have to maintain as a professional athlete, the access to resources you need during the off season and the cost of that. List goes on. And as I've talked about this story and other professional women's league stories, I found that so many people want to talk about this without ever talking about the structural inequities that we have and why paying people equally and investing in women's sports would cause these issues to go away. You physically cannot grow a sport without investing in it, and you are going to limit the amount of talent you have available if you refuse to pay them just a basic wage. Rant aside, that is what they were trying to solve with this lawsuit. In 2019, 3 months before the World Cup, they file a lawsuit suing the US Soccer Federation, their employer, for not paying them equally due to their gender. What should have really ensued was a pretty easy agreement and something that went through arbitration, especially given the fact that in that World Cup, they end up winning in a very dominant fashion. A lot of the women in LFG spoke about the fact that they felt that they had to show up at the highest possible level because they had now kind of thrown this gauntlet down, saying that they felt that they were worth more money and they wanted to prove their performance to the world. And they do throw down that gauntlet and use the World Cup to really explain why they belong there, to really show how intense their performance is. Not only do they win their 4th World Cup, but at the end of the game, the stadium was filled with two chants: USA, which is pretty typical for this type of thing, and equal pay. And yes, the stadium was full. 1.12 billion people worldwide tuned in to watch that game as well on television. And it was a real clear statement. The US women's national team was an incredible group of athletes that were outperforming their male counterparts, being paid less and given less opportunity to earn, and given less resources and funding in order to grow their program. Heading back to the US, it feels like this should be a pretty slam dunk situation where they can settle this lawsuit quickly and get equal pay. And despite that feeling, it's not that at all. If there were, it wouldn't be this long of a video. What happens instead is that we see the US Soccer Federation drag this lawsuit out into a very ugly, very public lawsuit that stretches until 2022. At the victory parade for the US women's national team after this 2019 World Cup that they held in New York, we actually saw the president of the US Soccer Federation give a speech where he acknowledged this lawsuit. After saying that he had seen players and fans both make their voices heard when it came to equality, he said, "We hear you, we believe in you, and we're committed to doing right by you." And that starts out kind of strong, right? Except he continues on to say that that is why the US Soccer Federation has invested more money in women's soccer than any other nation in the world. AKA, we've already given you way more than we think you deserve, and you should be happy to be here. He said that they would continue to invest, and his speech was stopped by the amount of boos from the crowd, which, yeah, pretty well earned. However, he did sort of end his speech on a sort of middle ground, but it should have been a red flag to know that this was about to get pretty ugly, because he said he believed that women deserved fair and equitable pay. And then he finished strong with a little bit of nationalism and said, "One nation, one team, go USA." If you watch LFG, you can see the footage of this speech, and you can also see Megan Rapinoe even give him a little bit of graciousness and try to say, "I think he's on our side, I think he's going to do right by us, and we're going to make this work." She continues the celebration with the fans and even kind of gives us this moment of saying, "Look, like, we're putting out our hand here. We're open to working with you if you can just work with us. We've just brought home a 4th World Cup. How can you possibly not understand that we're worth more money? That we're worth the same as our male counterparts?" But of course, that would be too easy. That would be too respectful and simple. Oh, and one of the things that I think is kind of left out of this conversation pretty often is that the president of the US Soccer Federation at the time, Carlos, he actually campaigned and won his seat based off of the fact that he said women deserved equal pay when it came to US soccer. And it was a tenement of his campaign strategy. However, as soon as he got into that seat and when he was presented with a real opportunity to actually make that possible, he did everything in his power to make sure that it didn't happen. So after this, we start to see some of the counter arguments from the US Soccer Federation about why they believe women should not be paid the same as men. A lot of their points are also some of the same points that you will see in the comment section, probably of this video and of every other video made about this pay dispute. I'm sure that if you've gotten to this point of the video, we're already seeing comments down below of people commenting and rage baiting despite the fact that the facts and figures you're looking for are right here in this video. But that's just the internet. So the first argument that they made was that there was not possibly a way for women to be paid less based off of their gender and to have been discriminated against, because some of the women over a 5-year period had earned more than some of the men on the US soccer team. What they intentionally left out here is that the women had played significantly more games than the men had, and that part of that was because the men had not qualified for the World Cup. The game appearance fees and the win bonuses, of course, did add up to more when they had to play significantly more games to actually earn them, and the men weren't winning. So when you look at this argument, this idea that women were being paid more than men were, it was not for the same amount of work. They were paid a very small amount more from these people that they had kind of cherry-picked, and it was based off of the fact that they had played a significant higher number of games and shown up to work more days. So yeah, if you're comparing your hourly wage at a job with your male coworker, and you get paid half of his hourly rate, but you show up to work for 80 hours that week, and he shows up to work for 39, you would earn a little bit more money than he did, but you worked twice as long. So this argument, this idea that they were being paid more money than the men were, does not hold up when you talk about the fact that they physically did more work. The next argument that the US Soccer Federation made in their counter argument, which is also the same argument that you will see made in a comment section or just with a random man on the street who decides he knows more than you and wants to get into an argument, is that the US men's national team earned more money and generated more money for the US Soccer Federation than the women did, given the fact that the FIFA World Cup prize money is larger as well as other tournament pools. Great argument, except for the fact that it wasn't true. For the time period being looked at for this lawsuit, the US women's national team generated more money for the US Soccer Federation than the men's team did. Again, because they were winning a lot more games. They were playing more games, they were participating in more tournaments, they were winning more games, and they actually qualified for the World Cup, which the men failed to do. So yes, if the men were actually good, they would have generated more money for the US Soccer Federation than the women did. But unfortunately for this lawsuit, that's not what happened. The women played better and they generated more revenue for the US Soccer Federation. And despite that, they were still paid less money than the men were. And then your next argument could possibly be that way more people in the US watch men's soccer than women's soccer. And it would be a great argument, except at that point, the highest rated soccer game in the US in the history of soccer airing in the US was in 2015, the FIFA Women's World Cup final, where the US women's national team took their third title. So just to recap, the women were not only bringing more money into the US Soccer Federation, they were also bringing higher ratings, filling more stadiums, had a bigger fan base, and were working much harder to earn less money. The final argument, which again you will see repeated and I have seen in my comment section a million times, is that the women agreed to this CBA, which is called a collective bargaining agreement, and that they had the opportunity to say that they wanted something else. The argument here, though, is that they were never presented with the same CBA that the men were. They were never presented with the same earning bonuses and potential, and so they were never able to actually decline that in favor of this other agreement. They agreed to the best agreement on the table that the US Soccer Federation was willing to give them during their CBA negotiations. They were never presented with the same opportunity that the men were, and therefore the agreement that they made was not an agreement that was ultimately fair. In their lawsuit, they actually calculated that had they been offered the same CBA as the men, they would have earned an additional $60 million across that roster over 4 years. So these are all of the arguments that not only are disputable, but also should have been kept private in this legal situation. However, why would we do that? There are men involved, and there were men that were losing in the court of public opinion. So on July 29th, 2019, the president of the US Soccer Federation decided to post an open letter on Twitter, specifically stating that they had paid the US women's national team more money than they had paid the US men's national team. This was a bad move. Ultimately, you have a man in power kind of spitting in the face of all of these women that are ultimately just trying to have a legal dispute after trying to resolve this in a sane manner. Instead, you have a man who is in this position of power, has the ability to make sure these things are changed, who was booed and had a number of sponsors and fans in the public very against him and his organization, decide to post an open letter of these kind of misconstrued facts onto Twitter to try to get the public opinion back on his side. It didn't work. Instead, what we saw was a number of soccer teams around the world asking for equal rights and equal pay for their women's teams. We also saw a number of high school teams, both girls and boys, in the US actually showing support on the field for this fight. And arguably most importantly, we saw a number of companies, which turns into sponsorships, which turns into money for the US Soccer Federation, publicly speak out in support of the US women's national team's fight for equal pay. Most notably, Secret actually took out a full-page ad in the New York Times in support of this fight for equal pay and saying that it was time to pay the women equally for the amount of play that they did. So public opinion-wise, everyone is on the US women's national team side. The legal arguments seem very sound, and of course, as they continue to go through this, they are also actively still winning tournaments. However, this lawsuit was not settled until 2022. What happens first is an attempt at mediation, which means that both sides of a lawsuit sit down and try to come to an agreement without actually going to trial. However, after a number of women from the US women's national team actually took time off from the middle of their season in the National Women's Soccer League to meet the US Soccer Federation for mediation, they were never presented with a legitimate option in terms of settling this case, which means that the case had to move forward to trial, and there was a date set for this jury trial. Now, once this trial date was set, obviously both sides were preparing their legal defense. But what happens at the same time is that while this lawsuit is ongoing, the women's team is still playing games under the employ of the US Soccer Federation. And one of the most notable moments for me in this case happens on International Women's Day in 2020. The US women's national team is competing in the She Believes tournament. And during that tournament on International Women's Day, the US Soccer Federation's legal argument is made public. And that argument is possibly the worst one that they could have come up with, and absolutely the worst one for it to have been made public. Because their argument that they were going to go to court with was that women were biologically inferior to men, and therefore their jobs as athletes were easier and warranted less pay. And now, as infuriating as that is to hear, I do want to say something that really genuinely made me laugh was that when I talked about this in a shorter video, a lot of the comments pointed out that even if that were true, the argument doesn't make any sense. If women were biologically inferior, they would also be working harder to play the same sport. And therefore, you're actually kind of arguing that they worked harder than the men did, and they got paid less anyway. It's a very stupid argument, and it's an argument that you want to be shocked was even written down, much less vetted by a number of lawyers and the US Soccer Federation, and then made public. But it's also not shocking. It's unfortunately an argument that we're hearing all the time. Female athletes don't work as hard hard as men do because they're not as intense. They're just biologically inferior. So, it's just not really sports. It is so narrow-minded, so simple, and maybe the dumbest and most dangerous concept that you can put out there when we're talking about women's sports. Because not only are you telling women of all ages and young girls that they are inferior to men, so they shouldn't even bother trying, you're also telling men and young boys that women are inherently weaker than them and worth less than them. And when you're doing this on a public stage while these women are absolutely dominating on that public stage and the men aren't, you're creating a cycle that it just never gets broken, and we continue to make it worse and worse and worse. Luckily, yeah, that was pretty much the way that everybody else felt about it too. So what we end up having in response to this at this She Believes tournament is this really powerful moment where the US women's national team decides to wear their jerseys inside out. Now, the players actually said that they were inspired by the Clippers doing the same thing earlier when they were having their dispute with the owner of the team, who ultimately was forced to sell the team, but a lot of that had to do with the public outrage that was coming from those comments that he had made. They chose to wear their warm-ups inside out so that the Clippers logo was not showing. They were playing for themselves and not for the team. And the US women's national team wanted to do something similar. Now, one of the interesting and kind of poetic differences that we saw with the US women's national team version of this is that when we look at both the men's and the women's kit, when we talk about the national team uniforms, they wear the same USA badge on their jerseys. However, the women's team has one difference. Because they've won 4 World Cups, they also have 4 stars above their emblem. The men's jerseys do not have any stars because they haven't won any World Cups, and you would add those on should they ever win one. So that's what those 4 stars denote. And because these jerseys are embroidered, what happened when they flipped them inside out is that while the USA patch didn't show, their 4 stars did. And so they take this photo before the match where none of them are smiling, because why would you smile when your employer has just said that he finds you biologically inferior? And that statement goes very, very viral very quickly. Ultimately, they end up winning that match again in a dominant fashion, taking home their 3rd title in 5 years at that tournament. And during the final minutes of play, the US Soccer Federation's president released a statement saying that he was completely unaware of the legal defense and that it did not reflect their values. This statement gets read out on ESPN on air while the women are playing to win that title. And it's ridiculous that we're not only seeing these statements being made, but also having to actually have them released in the midst of them winning a game. Trying to say that even though these are our lawyers, we had no idea that this was the argument they were going to take. We're totally uninvolved in this situation, which either you are completely uninvolved and that's a bad thing because it means you don't care, or you were involved and you were okay with this statement being made. The US Soccer Federation ultimately announced that they had actually fired that legal team, hired another, and also that the president was stepping down. But personally, I think it's really hard to recover from that kind of damage. You have someone who is supposed to be in charge of your best interests and in charge of giving you at least a working environment that's acceptable. And not only are you having to sue your employer for equal treatment, not only are you bringing home titles to your country and performing at the best of your abilities for less pay than your male counterparts who are not as successful, you also are dealing with a representative who ran on a campaign of bringing you equal pay that then backed away from it. And not only backed away from it, but then made a statement while you were on the field winning another championship to say that he doesn't think your job is as hard because you're a girl and girl chromosomes are pretty hard. Like they're not really athletic. Like, are you naturally athletic? I don't think so. It's just disgusting. There's really no other word for it. And it's unfortunate that it happened on such a public stage, but it's also fortunate that it did because there's no denying what this was. It was a blatant attempt to get away with paying women less money, despite the fact that they were doing the same job and performing better. Now, this case did have one very big hiccup after this, which was that in 2020, when they were set to go to this jury trial, the judge on their case dismissed their claims about equal pay, citing the fact that they had been paid more than the men had over that same period. Specifically citing that number that we talked about earlier, where they made more money, but they played significantly more games and had to work significantly more hours in order to make that small amount more than their male counterparts. Because of that, he ultimately ruled that the jury trial could not actually go forward in terms of the equal pay requirements, but was only going to be going forward on the claims of unequal treatment. These are the claims about unequal treatment when it came to flying, per diem, as well as facilities and resources to be able to play, but they were not able to go to court over the actual pay discrepancy. However, in that jury trial, they did end up winning their claims about facilities and unequal treatment. From there, they did appeal the decision to not be able to go to trial about equal pay, and they were granted that appeal. Ultimately, they settled that portion of the lawsuit, and that settlement included back pay for all of the players who were paid unequally during that period of time. Not only did they receive back pay, but now we have this new structure where the men's team and the women's team are paid the same for showing up to the games, and the prize funds are pooled and split equally. And that is the reason why women are entitled to half of the US men's national team's earnings at the FIFA World Cup. You've seen a headline that has been pretty disingenuous and generally clickbaity, kind of trying to say that this is a bad thing, but it's completely taking out the context of the reason why it happens. The US women's national team fought for equal pay and were found in a court of law to have been discriminated against. And the settlement that the US women's national team and the US Soccer Federation came to, which by the way was actually given a letter of support from the US men's national team saying they deserve to be paid equally, is the pay structure that we have now. This was not only a very important case for this specific team, but it was an important and landmark case for women all over when it comes to other sports and for soccer players around the world. This sets a legal precedent for women as athletes to sue their employers and to force equitable change, which allows those programs to grow into a stronger place. Women's sports is one of the fastest growing markets in the world, and it's one that will grow even faster if we actually invest in the talent and give them the resources that they need to grow. These leagues could be significantly larger than they are if they were being invested in properly. And the US women's national team not only earned what they're paid, but they were willing to fight for it. So hopefully this has provided you a little bit more context to these kind of clickbaity articles and videos that you're seeing. And I hope that these facts and figures helped you learn a little bit more about how this works and why it was such an important case. One of the things that I do want to leave you with is I highly recommend watching LFG, the documentary I referenced a couple of times in this video. It is a firsthand account from a number of the players involved in this lawsuit, and for me, I particularly enjoyed seeing a lot of the footage that they were able to put together, seeing players from the 1999 team talk about this and talk about the courage that they had, and also the number of differences in the way that those women were treated versus these women, and how the program for the US women's national team really grew because women were willing to make a sacrifice to play, not because they were being invested in. I really do believe in these types of things. Hearing from the players is the best way to really understand what was going on. And so again, that documentary is called LFG and it's available on HBO Max. In general, I also think following Megan Rapinoe and following some of the other women that are a part of the US women's national team from various generations is a big deal. And I encourage you to keep your eye out for The 99ers, a movie that I am super excited to see. If you have any questions or informed thoughts after listening to the video, I would love to know about them in the comments down below. And of course, be sure to follow along for other sports breakdowns and explainers and kind of the intersection of sports and culture on this channel. Until next time, you can find me on all platforms at Marissa Kumari, and I will see you in the next video.